Welcome back to the Messy Reformation. My name's Jason Rice. I'm the lead pastor at Faith Community CRC in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. My co-host is Willie Cronky. He's a member at Pease CRC in Pease, Minnesota. We're just a couple of guys who love the Christian Reformed Church and want to see Reformation happen in our denomination. But we realize that whenever Reformation happens in the history of the church, things get messy. And coming out of Synod 2024, things continue to be messy. So we're taking the opportunity to have conversations with pastors throughout the Christian Reformed Church to find out what's going on in our denomination, but also to talk about what Reformation might look like. If you haven't already, take a moment, click subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. We're dropping episodes every single Sunday evening. It's also important for you to know that you are our marketing plan. We rely on you to spread the word about what we're doing at the Messy Reformation. We rely on you to share our content. We also rely on you to give us 5-star reviews and provide good feedback for this podcast so that the algorithms put out our content further into the world. You are our marketing plan, and we believe we've placed our marketing in good hands. You can also support us financially on Patreon or Substack. All of the money raised is used to further the mission and the platform of the Messy Reformation. With all that said, we're going to get to this week's episode, which is part 2 of our conversation with Rob Toornstra.
So look at it this way. Billy Graham was probably the most successful evangelist of, probably in all of history, if you go by numbers. Now I realize that's kind of a complicated metric, but Billy Graham, I don't think would be anywhere close to as successful today if he were using the same methods, because he was working out of in the 1950s and 60s, he's working in a culture in which there was agreement on, there is a standard of morality, and I try hard to meet that standard, but I maybe and so all what Billy Graham had to do was say, well, this is what God's standard is, and you're not meeting up, and so repent and believe, and well, that works then, but what happens with when our culture has changed that standard? Number one, it's internalized it. So the locus of that standard is no longer external; it's internal. It's what do I decide is right and wrong, and how, that might be fine for you, and so we're all. We've become an incredibly self-centered culture, and so how do you appeal to that? How do you speak to that? It doesn't work the way it once did, and that's why I think presuppositional apologetics is a more effective tool, at least in my subculture, and probably increasingly so in broader American culture as well.
Well, and just to tie in what kind of both of you were saying, Rob, the way that you ultimately get somebody to adopt your presupposition is if they first abandon their own. And then Jason, I can confirm exactly what you were saying. You did have that in your sermons. And this is what the world is teaching you, but here's what Scripture says. And then you subtly would say, and isn't this a correct way to view the world in which we live? Yeah. So I would say that's very much in the way that you preached. And Rob, you're kind of touting that too right now.
Right. So to go back to Mars Hill, remember, this is kind of front and center in my mind for a number of reasons. I was actually there this summer. And so, Paul, as far as we can tell, Paul is preaching that sermon on Mars Hill at the Areopagus, and as I imagine it, he's facing his audience, and his audience, of course, is facing him. And if that's the case, and then his audience would be looking over Paul's shoulder, and what are they looking at? They're looking at the temple of Athena, and in that temple is this massive sculpture of the goddess Athena, and one of the things you'll remember in Paul's message there in Acts 17, he actually says, our God does not dwell in temples made with human hands, and he's not made out of gold or silver. And so what he's doing there is he's first challenging, and he's sort of showing, okay, you believe that your gods are so big and so powerful, but it's kind of like that line from Aladdin, the movie, right? All this great and power and might in this itty bitty little living space, right? And so Paul is showing the limits of their own belief. And then he's saying, guess what? My God, the God that I'm proclaiming to you, can't be contained in this, even as majestic as a structure as this is, the God that I'm talking to you about, the entire universe is his dwelling place. And he's not like your God that's so aloof and far off, and you hope that maybe you can connect to him somehow, but he's right here. He's created you to have your meaning and purpose in him. And he doesn't come out and say it, but the message there is what you're getting at, Willie, which is, isn't that, to use Tim Keller's phrase, even if you don't believe this, you want to believe it. You want to believe that this is true. And maybe then, maybe that opens your mind, or at least it stirs a longing in you to pursue this.
Yeah. Yeah, that's you're obviously striking a chord with Willie and I. This is something we're both pretty passionate about. I was just thinking, I did a series at a winter retreat a few years ago, and my whole goal of the series was to help. I just called it The Beautiful Life, trying to help people understand the picture of the good life that's being portrayed in all of the music and the songs from the world, and then contrasting it with the beautiful life that God has called us to, and helping them see, like, isn't this more beautiful? And there's something inside of you that sees this picture of what God has called us to be. And that's there's something that in you that wants that, right?
That's right. And it's sort of like, to go back to poetry and music and cultural products. I mean, I think of the movie The Gladiator, or Gladiator. I know there's a sequel coming out. I'm referring to the 2000 one that came out. That whole movie is presenting this image of what the beautiful life is. I mean, I think it even uses pretty close to that exact same language. And then there's the tie-in with, heaven is portrayed in there. So it's like, here's this movie that's communicating this idea of what the beautiful life is. Now, we all have some vision of what that looks like. My secular humanist friend has a vision for what the beautiful life would be. We've got to do good for each other. We've got to, you don't need religion to be good. In fact, the good life would be one without religion, but we should all act justly and we should all be kind to one another. Well, you begin to, here's where the apologist in me wants to just start poking holes, because, okay, so how do you, and I've asked them these questions, and it makes for good discussion. How do you define what's good? Because in some cultures, the good life means that you hold a grudge against the person who wrongs you, and you exact revenge on them. And in other cultures, you practice forgiveness. So which is better? The people, some of the tribes in remote parts of the world, they believe that justice meant you kill and eat your neighbor. It's like, well, is that what we want to do? And do you pronounce a moral judgment on that? And if so, by what means do you get to pronounce a moral judgment on a primitive tribe that, cannibalizes their enemies, if they're just living the good life, right? And so you run into trouble like that pretty quickly. And of course, it's tied to this fact that you've got this internal, when you make morality internal, as our culture has done and is doing, that feels very liberating, but it opens up a can of worms that I'm not sure we want to really open up.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also I feel like it's one of the things that really struck me. I think it started off reading John Piper and his whole understanding of Christian hedonism, because I remember, like, growing up in the church, and there was like a period, it was never explicitly said, but I just remember having this feeling like, well, I just have to believe this stuff and I have to just do this thing. And if I do the stuff, then I'm doing it. It's not really fun. It's not really good. I kind of hate it, but I just got to do it. And I just have to be faithful. And it's kind of like this, like, just gut it out, do the hard thing. And what that ends up leading to every time, I think, is legalism. It's like, well, I'm more righteous because I'm gutting it out and doing the right thing. I'm more righteous than you because I can do the hard thing of doing devotions, and I can do the hard thing of going to church. And rather than the other flip side of it is, no, this is beautiful. It's actually so much better for you to be doing the thing. And it's hard, but you're doing it not because you're better than somebody, but because you have the beauty and the joy and the opportunity to be able to enter into
Right.
the presence of God and live this beautiful life.
That's right. I think our culture takes for granted the idea that people ought to be or are miserable. You know, in other words, I when you read through, kind of sometimes it's just mind-numbing stuff, stuff on Reddit or whatever. Good use of time, but it does give you, if only a brief or limited glimpse into sort of human thought and cultural, sort of the cultural milieu. Is work is supposed to be drudgery. We're all supposed to be anxious and depressed all the time. Family relationships are supposed to be always just a mess. It's sort of just, that's the assumption, I think, that our culture has. We just like, this is normal. Brene Brown has done a lot of work on the topic of shame. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her writing. She's not really I wouldn't consider her writing from a Christian vantage point, but she gets pretty close to a lot of some key Christian ideas on the topic of shame. But, she points out, and she actually says it really well. She says, we are the most addicted, in debt, anxious, and depressed generations in recorded history. And now there's a myriad of reasons for that, but I think it's an accurate description of where we're at. And we just sort of assume this is what life is. This is all there is. And it's like, well, now, are Christians free from that automatically? No, of course not. Of course not. We struggle with those things. Christians are not happy all the time. Christianity is not just a silver bullet or a magic, spell that you cast and make everything go away. But I also think we have, if Jesus is right, we know where that living water is. And it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't take away all the pain and anxiety and depression immediately, but it does say, yeah, but here's where we go. And here's something that is nourishing our soul and our spirit. And, we can hold that up, I think. And I think that, that reaches some of the longings of our culture and speaks to some of the pain and loneliness and angst that our culture experiences.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's a more hopeless feeling than to have pain and anxiety and fear and have nowhere to go with it?
Yeah.
Just to be helplessly sitting there with nowhere, nothing.
Well, look, when you're told since you're a real young person that you are just, you're the product of a million years of, chemical and organic changes, and you're really just a bag of fertilizer. And when the time comes, you're going to be put back into the ground. And look, I got an email from someone just yesterday, had very, very limited connection with our church over the years, but it's just like, well, can I meet with you? I'm just struggling with this idea that when we take our last breath, that's it. It's like, well, yeah, I would struggle with that too. That's enormously depressing. Like when you actually drill down and take the time to think about your worldview and all the implications that it engenders, hard pass for me. That is depressing as all get out. Mm-hmm. And so, we've got record rates of, teen suicide and teen depression. We're numbing and medicating them by, smartphones and device usage. It's like, you start to see, why are we in the position that we're in as a culture? It's like, it starts to make a little bit of sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's why too, right? If you listen to any secular podcast right now, maybe not any, but many of them are going to be focused, especially the self-help ones, are going to be focused on how do you create and find meaning in the world, right? And so, and then again, all the onus is on you. You have to create your own meaning. You have to come up with something because there is no meaning and purpose for your life. And so you have to get away in a retreat and craft your meaning and purpose to be able to live in this world.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, I think even they deceive themselves a little bit because, they talk about happiness as if they know that is our natural end that we're supposed to, be pursuing. And what does the Westminster Catechism say? What is man's chief end? To glorify God and be miserable the rest of your life? No, it's to glorify God and to fully enjoy him forever. Or as the psalmist would say, find your deepest and most enduring satisfaction. So even there, again, we have a presuppositionalist, the image of God is oozing out of them and they just can't even help themselves.
Yeah. That's exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah, it's a clear. I think it is a clear, like the fact that on the one hand it's oozing out of them, and yet on the other hand they're suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. Right? There's a sense of like, I know this is in here, but I got to just shove it down.
Right, and I think that's a very, very important point to remember, because if you're like me, your default setting is to be hard on people who don't believe. And I see this in myself. I see this in a lot of folks, even CRC folks, CRC culture, especially because we emphasize historically good theology and knowledge and that we've got this long legacy of that. But what happens when we encounter people that suppress the truth, right? Our pagan neighbors. Mm-hmm. We tend to be overly critical or condescending towards them, and we forget that any knowledge that we have of the truth is something that God has given to us. And so, I think of what Jude says. I think it's Jude 23, where he says, "Be merciful with those who doubt." I have to remind myself of that. I have to remind my church of that, because we live around a lot of people who doubt, who are skeptical about the claims of Christianity. And if we aren't careful, we can act like, we've got this all figured out because we're so smart. We've figured out, what true happiness is and where it comes from. And then we come into people whose lives are a mess, and they're living together with people, or they're moving in, multiple serial relationships, one after the other. And this kid's born to that father and another to the next. And rather than look at that as a case of a deeply hurting person trying to satisfy the longings of their heart, where, in all these other things, the way Jesus looks at the woman at the well, if we aren't careful, we tend to be, we focus only on the moral behavior. Oh, that person, look at all the wrong things that they're doing, and we need to get them to church, and we need to do this and that. And then, then they'll be happy like us. It's like, well, no, let's reframe how we look at that. Let's look at this as a person made in the image of God, and except for God's grace, you'd be no different. Mm-hmm. You know the way to eternal life, but you approach them as a co-traveler on that road, so to speak. We don't. I know that I don't always do that well. I know folks in my church, I think, sometimes struggle with that. And yet, to see that image of God, to see them, to reframe our way of looking at the lost, not just as being condemning towards them because they're not doing the right moral things, but to be compassionate and merciful with those who doubt, is something that, especially here where we're surrounded by a lot of folks who doubt, to see the hurting person, the hurting image bearer beneath that, and to invite them to seek after what can truly satisfy.
Yeah, I don't remember where it was. I wish I had. I'll have to go find it sometime. But I think John Newton gave the illustration of you being with a group of people trapped in a pit somewhere, and somebody reaches in and pulls you out of the pit. You don't stand over the pit and look down at them and say, right, "You stupid people who are stuck in the pit." You go, one, thank God that he pulled me out of that pit. And two, please, may I present to you the gospel so that he could pull you out of the pit too. You don't look down on them as being better than them, because God pulled you out by his grace.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's just a helpful, this connects with some of the conversations we've been just having lately on the podcast, is regarding how do we as a Christian Reformed church learn how to do evangelism better and how to engage our culture better. Right. And that's come up the last few years at Synod, especially, Scott Vanderplug's little moment at Synod a couple years ago, making the plea that, like, hey, we need to do better at reaching our culture. And so there's a lot of gather events kind of happening, trying to talk about some of that. And there's a little bit more conversation about it. But I think one of the things we're wanting to do is talk about how do we do this better. And I think we have to change, like you said, we're kind of reframe how we see the people around us, and then reframe even our understanding of our culture and how we engage with the gospel. I mean, a lot of the conversation we've had throughout this podcast has really been about how do we bring the gospel effectively
Yeah.
into the communities around us?
Yeah.
Well,
That's
and
right.
just to talk about the Gather event really quick here, Rob, I know that you had actually attended the Gather in Minneapolis
That's right.
back this last spring. I think you met some representatives from my church as well.
Yeah, I think I did. Yep.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, as someone who attended that, I was not able to attend
Mhm.
that event, but as somebody who was able to attend, what things particularly did you see that were of value? Did you see kind of tools that were able to help equip people to engage culture or to, do some of these, things we've been talking about?
So my response to that is going to sound bad, and then I'm going to make it better. No, but I don't think it was intended to do that. And so what I think, the value was, there was value in connecting people together and helping us focus on prayer and brainstorming together. Now, I had some questions about the exegesis that was done on the text that was provided for us. Okay, so there's some things that I thought, I'm not sure we're going at this quite the right way. My understanding is, and I raised this in I raised this with some of the leadership, and the response I heard was, yeah, we hear that, and they brought in one of the professors from Calvin Seminary to frame the exegesis a little bit better. Now, I don't, I was at the very first one, and so, fully understand I'm a guinea pig, and there's the first time I do something, I don't get it right. So I'm trying to hopefully communicate my patience and, openness to the fact that they've strengthened this a little bit. So I thought the exegesis on the text wasn't always rock solid. I don't know that I came away with great new ideas on how to do discipleship, but I don't think that was the purpose. I think the purpose was to network us together, to encourage, to pray together, and I think it did that pretty well. There's some things other things that I would critique in terms of, execution of what they wanted us to do, but that seems less relevant here.
Sure.
So that's kind of my response specifically to what you're asking, Willie, in terms of did it really do a good job of helping us know how to engage? No, I don't think so, but I think for their stated purpose, I don't know that was part of it. And so I don't know that I'd hold it against them. And I'm also, here's the other thing. I'm not convinced that the best way to catalyze this in the denomination is to do meetings like the Gather, or I don't think it can be so much a top-down thing. I think it's more of a localized effort. Now maybe I'm just trying to, justify why these things don't always work, but it just strikes me that it has to. I'll put it this way: evangelism and outreach in Salem, Oregon, is going to look very different than evangelism and outreach in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, or West Michigan, or wherever else. And so my church, maybe not so much as it was years ago, but we'd be pretty leery about a group, hypothetically, if a group were to come from Grand Rapids and say, we want to hold a meeting in Salem, Oregon, and tell you how to do discipleship. It'd be like, that wouldn't go over well. We had a group about 10 or 15 years ago that came out and wanted to, they led a seminar. They wanted to do a talk on social justice, and it did not go over well. It felt like these sort of know-it-all people coming in, and I want to be careful on how I'm saying this. I'm not saying it was this. I'm saying this is kind of the perception. These sort of insider people from West Michigan that were going to come and tell us how to do justice without knowing a thing about our context. And then even the way that it was presented, it just felt very condescending. And I'm not saying that there's nothing to offer in terms of a denominational initiative, but I think it has to come from grassroots much more than West Michigan, or top down is not quite the right way to say it, but yeah, you get what I'm driving at, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think they're. I don't really know what it looks like. I'm kind of a bigger picture guy, so I've got some conceptual things in my head on how. I think this is the denomination's attempt, right? Because I remember even when I spoke to Scott Vanderplug's motion from the floor, I said, I think the denomination can oversee something that is grassroots, and they're kind of helping kind of facilitate. So I think that's what they're trying to do through these gather events. I don't know. Again, I'm not trying to be like overly critical. I'm glad they're trying something. But I also think it probably could be done differently and probably more effectively, but I don't have the golden solution here to tell anybody either.
It's like I like to say, I'm great at finding problems, but I'm not so good at finding solutions. Right?
Yeah, and I'm part of me wonders if we could use our regional resonate people to kind of work with our classes. Well,
I'll give you, like I'll just give you an example. We had our classes meeting not 2 days ago, but the weekend before, and we did an event the night before. We had Mark Quist up. And Mark is I think he's in Boulder, but he's got connections with Scott because we've had Scott before to speak to us as well. And he just it wasn't a long or lengthy thing, but he sort of made the case for discipleship, and he presented some material, 222 material. I'm not sure. I was not familiar with it until this classes meeting and this pre-classes meeting thing. But that to me was helpful because it said, think about discipleship in terms of it's a one-on-one thing. Does not need to be intimidating, and here's some resources to help you do it. Now we'd have to adapt it and use it in each individual setting would have to adapt it. But the point is that it was focused on the region. It was a classes initiative. Our classes said we want to do this better. We brought in some outside help to give us some understanding of how to do it better, but it was more rooted in the classes, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I've said this numerous times over the last few years that I think the future of the denomination actually is going to be in moving some of the, for lack of a better word, power out of the denomination and down into the classes because it's more local. It's more, each other. There's more trust there.
I think so.
And if we could move some of this thing down to a more classical level, I think that would be a big step in the right direction in helping with some of this.
I think so.
Well, and to that exact point, Rob, when this was being presented to us at COD, I think the gathering that had happened in Minneapolis, that was the first. That was the only one to be reported on at that point. And then it was revealed that all of these gatherings were actually taking place outside of Grand Rapids intentionally. And I actually saw that as I would call a fair ball on that. I think that's people saying, we understand this context very well. We don't necessarily understand others. So I did kind of see that as a concerted effort to kind of meet classes where they were actually at. I saw that intentionality anyway.
Yeah, I think so. I think there is this increasing awareness because, well, look, let me give you a really small example. And maybe it's illustrative of this thing that we're talking about. When we have COD meetings online in February, I get to eat my lunch at 9:30 in the morning because 9:30 on the West Coast is 12:30 in Grand Rapids. And, I've raised that a couple times. Now, look, that's a really minor thing. I'm not, well, I am griping, but I don't mean to be griping about, having to eat an early, but I think that just might suggest that the bias and all the implications of that they're more baked into the culture than people have initially realized. But I also think that what's happening is there's this growing awareness of, this Grand Rapids culture has roots that go way deeper than we've actually realized. And we need to do something about that. And, so I think that's exactly right, Willie. It's like if you're going to do these gather events, let's not do them in Grand Rapids, please. I love visiting Grand Rapids, but, I'm not, Minneapolis was, or St. Paul, I guess is where we technically had it. It's different. It gets us outside of that little bubble. I wish, why didn't they schedule mine for Orlando, Florida? But, that's God's sovereign plan, I guess. Right.
In January, right?
Right. Instead of, it always felt like January in St. Paul when I was there. It was like, you guys had like a record cold snap or something out in Minneapolis there in Minnesota at that time. It was like below freezing. But anyways, I'm griping again. So
yeah, amen. Well, thanks, Rob. We're coming kind of close to the end of our time here, and one of the things we just like to leave every pastor or everybody we interview with an opportunity to kind of just give a final word to everybody who's listening. And we have a really broad range of people who are listening to this podcast, broader than Willie and I ever imagined listening to this podcast, anywhere from pastors to elders and deacons to lay people to teenagers, middle schoolers are even listening a little bit. And so we have a pretty broad range. Awesome. And so like, what would be some final words you'd want to leave with them?
I think as this is just kind of what instinctively comes to mind. So I think the CRC has a lot to be proud of. We're in a tough time right now. There's no getting around that. No matter what would have happened at the last couple synods with the HSR, we would be in hard times. That there's no getting around that. Our culture is in a very conflicted time, and so on the one hand, I don't want to deny that, and I don't want to downplay that. And of course, like we've been talking about, we've got to learn how to engage that. But, the CRC also has a long and rich history of good theology. It's easy to be critical of thinkers, right? It's easy to be critical of people who, and just sort of assume that, well, theology is just all in their mind. But no, I don't, there's a long history of theology and piety that have mixed really well together. We haven't always been perfect, not by any stretch. Never will be until Jesus returns. But I think we can be proud of that heritage. I think we can be proud of who we are, proud in the sense of recognizing that, yeah, God has blessed us. And, there's a lot of things we don't do well, but there's a lot of things that by God's grace we do well, and we can be proud of that, and maybe that's our contribution to the broader church community. This legacy of thought and thoughtfulness about issues that matter, and So anyways, I could go on, but I just maybe want to encourage us with that, and let's be thankful to God for how He's blessed us and for who we are, and yet maintaining that humility that ought to go along with that, and that graciousness that ought to characterize a denomination that believes so strongly in the doctrines of grace.
That's all we have for this week. If you want to help us out and support the Messy Reformation, another thing you can do is sign up for our newsletter through Substack. That way, you'll get episodes and summaries sent directly to your email inbox. It will also give us the opportunity to communicate with our audience, which is one of the biggest struggles of a podcast. So head over to the Messy Reformation on Substack and sign up for our newsletter. But until then, don't forget this is Christ's church, and He bought it with His blood. And we've been warned that wolves will come in trying to destroy the flock. So keep a close watch on your life and on your doctrine. Preach the word in season and out of season. And keep fighting the good fight in this messy Reformation.